With all the resources and money put into the navies of especially Germany and Britain, you'd think they would have actually used their ships more. But the first 2 years, Germany was afraid to actually use the navy that it had spent the last 30 years building. So a good part of the reason for World War I starting was because of the arms race, particularly the arms race in dreadnought battleships. Neither Britain nor Germany were willing to risk those battleships. Like I said, they were so resource intensive to make and to run that you never wanted to put them at risk and actually make them go to battle, which is what they were made for. So the war at sea was pretty much inconclusive to the extent that any side was winning. It was definitely Britain because they were able to blockade Germany and use their larger fleet to cut traffic off from Germany's ports and bottle their navy up in their harbors. So the Germans could have ordered their dreadnoughts to go confront the British dreadnoughts, but they never did. What Germany did have was a squadron of light and medium-sized cruisers. A cruiser is basically something in between a destroyer and a battleship. It's smaller than a battleship and lighter, so it can go a little faster, maneuver faster, but it's got bigger guns than a destroyer, and so it can take down other ships with its guns relatively quickly. And Germany had a few of these, what were called fast cruisers, stationed in different parts of the world that were patrolling between its colonies. And then there was another one or two that were stationed in the Indian Ocean and also moving in between what few German colonies they had. So when the war started, the Germans put these cruisers to work attacking Allied merchant shipping, mostly British ships, and they were quite successful for the first few months, to the extent that the British finally ordered their navy to chase down the German cruiser squadron, commerce raiders, and destroy them, which they finally did in a couple battles off the coast of South America. The cruisers were at sea for too long. They couldn't get back because of the blockade, and so they were in pretty bad shape by the time they went into battle, and the British ships overwhelmed them. There were only a few naval battles. There was one called the Battle of Helgoland Bight, which is north of in the North Sea, north of Denmark. And in that, there were a couple German cruisers sunk by the British Navy. And then there was a battle in early 1915 called the Battle of Dogger Bank, which I'll have a little clip from. And but generally speaking, all those engagements were inconclusive. And the Germans lost a little bit more than the British, generally speaking. And that made the Kaiser even more afraid to use the Navy. So nothing essentially happened at sea. The Germans were unwilling to confront the British fleet that was blockading its ports, and their cruiser commerce raiders had been destroyed after the first 6 months of the war. So there really wasn't much else to do besides use submarines, and that's what Germany really doubled down on, was the use of submarines. The psychological effect of them was much more than the real effect. Germany didn't have enough submarines to strangle Britain's commerce. They destroyed about 4% of incoming merchant shipping into Britain in the first couple of years of the war. But the submarines faced heavy losses themselves. They had to surface, generally speaking. The World War I submarines had to surface in order to attack. So they had a low profile, so they could sneak up pretty close on the surface, and then they could dive, and then they could come back up to the surface, then attack, and then dive again to get away. But destroyer escorts would learn to recognize them and attack them or counterattack after they were spotted. So that was the extent of the Sea War for the first 2 years. Not much really happened, surprisingly enough. Again, given that this was one of the reasons for the war. You'd think that you'd actually use your weapons that you spent a crap ton of money on, but surprisingly they didn't. Another event to come out of the first years of the war was the Armenian genocide. So after the Ottoman Empire got into the war, it was similar to Germany and the other countries. The Ottoman Empire had this propaganda that said, we're going to get back what we lost, and they had this plan to get back some of the lands they lost in the Balkan region. They fought a battle on their southwestern frontier nearby Egypt, thinking they would retake some of that territory that Britain had taken over. And the Turks were also under pressure from Russia, and they wanted to recapture some territory in the Caucasus region, or in what's now eastern Turkey, that had been lost to Russia. And in it all were these people that had a very vulnerable status within the Ottoman Empire, the Armenians. The Armenians were generally Christian, and the more orthodox leadership of the Ottomans were not very kind to the Christians within their empire. That had started to change in the late 19th, early 20th century with the assumption of power of some reform-minded leaders called the Young Turks. But as a result of very quick losses right after the start of World War I, the Young Turks, who had been very much for the war, they lost a lot of status and lost a lot of power. And so they were pushed aside, and the people who took power, who wanted to punish the people that they thought were responsible for their losses and who they blamed, were their various minorities, especially the Armenians. Armenians had been hated within the Ottoman Empire for quite some time, hundreds of years, and they had been persecuted before. Not long ago, in the late 1900s, they were blamed for Turkey's loss in the Balkan Wars. They were blamed again for a series of losses early in 1914 and then in 1915. So the new leadership of Turkey blamed the Armenians and started engaging in various actions against them using the military, and because they said they were responsible somehow for the losses, for sabotaging or for espionage or something like that. And so the first thing they did was round up a lot of the men and put them to work in basically work camps, which killed off a lot of them because of the brutal treatment. And then they went through again in the Armenian areas and started killing all the boys. Any male that was under 30 years old and over about 10 years old could be a target, and so many of them were killed. And then the rest of the people were rounded up and sent to various parts of the empire, or sent outside the country in a forced march. And some of them were put in work camps and things like that and worked to death. And so essentially the term genocide became used to describe this. That term was around before, but this was something that the term really seemed to describe, since it was all targeted at this particular ethnic group. It was extremely brutal, the actions taken against them. In some cases, or we don't know exactly how many were killed, but we think that it may have been, throughout the period of the war, there were several 100,000 killed just in 1915 alone. But up until the 1920s, we think there may have been about 1.5 million Armenians killed by the Ottoman Turks. Even today, the country of Turkey doesn't recognize that the Armenian genocide actually happened. They don't like to acknowledge it, and people within Turkey who try to publicize it or study it can actually get arrested. Another aspect of war that got much more sophisticated throughout World War I was the operations regarding propaganda. So propaganda was designed for several purposes, and it had been used obviously in warfare before, but it got much more technical and much more sophisticated in the First World War. So there's three reasons your country engages in propaganda. One is to motivate your own civilians to support the war effort and make your population proud of what they're doing, why they're fighting. Another is to dehumanize the enemy, make the enemy look like horrible creatures that you want to destroy because you have to destroy them because they're so dangerous. And then your third reason for propaganda is to confuse your enemy and to make your enemy think that things are happening that aren't really happening, and it's directed at the civilians in your enemy's country. So all of the belligerents did this to some extent. The ones who did the best job, and I have French propaganda on here, and the French were imaginative in their propaganda, but the most efficient operations were in Germany and then eventually in the United States, although Britain had a pretty effective propaganda machine as well. Germany's office of propaganda was so effective that a lot of Germans didn't really know what was going on in the war. The German government's position was that average people are too stupid to recognize fake information and distinguish it from real information. So they basically put out just a flood of what we would today call fake news, and basically said, we're winning the war, until they were losing the war. It's one reason why it was so hard for Germans to take their loss in 1918, because the propaganda was good enough that most of them were of the opinion that Germany was winning, even though by 1918 it clearly was not. Britain also had an effective propaganda office. It was called Wellington House, and they put out a series of different kinds of propaganda. The French did an interesting job with film. So did the Germans. That was a new technology, movies, and so all the countries got involved in producing propaganda films. The French specialized in that to some extent, and so there were all kinds of propaganda. And the best way that it worked was when the civilians change their mind and they think they're doing it of their own accord. And the way you do that is actually have them pay for the propaganda. So they would purchase various advertising or products that had advertising in them, and then they would become of the opinion that the propaganda wanted. And so that's where propaganda was the most effective, is when you actually had the civilian populace pay for it through the various things that they read anyway, or they wanted to read, or you kind of hook them with something that they like, and then you reinforce the ideas you want using the propaganda, and then your population believes what you want it to believe. So this the science of psychology was just getting underway in the early 20th century, and that helped inform these operations significantly, and so they were very effective. The U.S. through all this was sitting out. It was neutral, although not really neutral. The U.S. was helping out the Allies far more than the Germans or than the Central Powers, in large part because the Allies cut off German communications with the Americas. So the British, one of the first things they did was cut the telegraph lines that went across the ocean. So there was no real way for Germany to send information to the U.S. It wasn't clear at first that the U.S. would be pro-Allied, because they had been competitors with Britain before, and not always the most friendly with France, although sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. But there was a large German population that had recently immigrated to the United States, and so some people thought the U.S. would be sympathetic to Germany because of that. But it really wasn't, in large part because the Allies were much more effective at getting propaganda to North America. And so what the American populace was consuming was mostly the pro-Allied propaganda, and so they believed pretty much everything bad about Germany. But American tradition up to that point had been to not get involved in foreign wars, especially European wars. Europe was seen by many Americans as a mess, kind of like we today see the Middle East, and it was a place that most Americans did not want to get involved militarily in because it would be some kind of quagmire. The U.S. remained neutral, and there was a strong domestic feeling that the U.S. should remain neutral. And you saw songs like "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier." That was the number one song of 1915 in the United States. A lot of people argued that, America, it says it's neutral, but it's kind of not, because it sells ammunition to the Allied side and not really the German side. So it's helping the Allied side fight the war and extending the war as a result. So America was involved, but not exactly neutral, even though it said it was. There were groups within America, though, that said the U.S. needed to get into the war. One of the most prominent advocates of that was the former President Theodore Roosevelt. He desperately wanted to get into the war, thought it was something the U.S. needed to do out of a sense of moral imperative. But the sitting president, Woodrow Wilson, he resisted that, and America wasn't prepared in 1914 or 15 to get involved with the war anyway. So the U.S. stayed out. There was a big push to get the U.S. in with the sinking of the Lusitania, which was a major scandal. Lusitania was an ocean liner, and British ocean liner, and it traveled between New York and Britain. And it was attacked by a German U-boat, submarine, and sunk. Something like 120 Americans were on board. They had been told, the German government had actually taken out an ad in the New York Times warning Americans don't travel to Britain on ocean liners because they might be subject to attack. The German Foreign Office in America had taken out those ads. But that 120 or so Americans ignored that, and they ended up being some of the casualties in the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, in reality, Lusitania was technically an ocean liner, but it was also classified as an auxiliary cruiser by the British, and it was almost certainly carrying guns and ammunition that it had collected in America, along with passengers. And so it technically was a legitimate target, but it had a lot of civilians on it. And when the Germans attacked it, a lot of Americans were just livid about the loss of life against a passenger ship, even though it technically had arms and ammunition on it, and it actually was armed with some guns that it wasn't able to bring to bear on the U-boat. But after that, there was a movement throughout America called preparedness. And the idea was the U.S. is going to get into the war sooner or later. It may not get into war right now, but it needs to be prepared. And so there was a push to have more military training for boys and young men, push to start stockpiling munitions, and in general, just preparing to enter the war sooner or later. So by the end of 1915, beginning 1916, the big question was, is this war ever going to stop? It had been going on for more than a year and a half, and nothing seemed to be reaching any kind of resolution. Austria-Hungary had been pushed back to some extent from its frontiers, but it was still defending itself in the Carpathian Mountains. There had been new fronts opened up in Turkey and in Greece. Those weren't doing anything. There was fighting going on in Africa and on the seas. That wasn't changing anything. The Eastern Front was somewhat successful for the Germans, but it wasn't changing a ton of the general situation of the war. So the big focus was the Western Front, and that didn't seem to be changing. It was in this locked-in situation of stalemate. The whole world was kind of at a loss to understand it, and most certainly the belligerents themselves. And what they started thinking to try to break the stalemate were new and even more terrifying means of prosecuting a war, which we'll talk about in the next unit. So now you've got some documentaries to watch, and that will talk about these earlier years of the war, and some of them go into more detail on some of the issues we talked about, and you've got some readings to do over the same period. So thanks for tuning in to this content lecture for Unit 2, and we'll see you for the next one.